Let me start with this. There is nothing more exciting for a famous rock star student to come back to his old college. And don't worry, I'm not talking about myself or my college. I'm talking about Delhi School of Economics. And who's our rock star old alumnus but Professor Amartya Sen. Professor Sen,
you're very kind. Thank you.
welcome to Walk the Talk. And,
Thank you.
And welcome back to Delhi School of Economics.
Wonderful to be back here.
I think after a long time.
After, I think, about a dozen years now. It's great to be back here.
And a lot has changed. We see the commerce block has come up.
This is
wasn't
new.
the case
Yeah.
earlier. So all economists do not have to become professors now.
No, but I think Delhi School of Economics had a stream of products of different kind. Academics, people who went into professional life of other kinds, and business too, and commerce. Right. But the totality of that. No, it's been a great school. It still remains a great school.
But this has been the engine of economic thought over these many decades. And many of your students have become stars.
Well, I'm very proud of them. And certainly it has been my most important formative period of thinking when I got the Nobel. Most of the work that was cited were actually done when I was in Delhi School of Economics in the 60s. So this has been, for me, a very moving as well as formatively integrative process in my life.
And you can see we are collecting crowds as you might with a Bollywood star.
No. If you stand in Delhi School of Economics, you will get crowds, no matter who it is.
And that's how it was in your times also. So tell us about some of your students.
Well, I think probably the greatest, certainly one of the greatest I've ever had was Prashanta Patnaik.
Right.
He came here shortly after I moved in '63, and he became one of the leading social choice theorists in the world, changed the nature of the subject. I still remember his arriving from Orissa, not technically trained, but he trained and with a level of intelligence and talent that was totally extraordinary.
What Americans call raw smarts.
He was, and I remember giving him various problems to solve, which people didn't know the answer to at that time. And he solved them usually in about 1/10 of the time that I expected he would do.
In the pre-computer era, more or less. And some of the others?
There were many. You see, some came here, some came from St. Stephen. There was, I think, Kaushik Basu went there. Roger Dev was a student here. There was a whole lot of people coming out. I think we can take a whole program
in fact,
Walk the Talk.
In fact, the last Walk the Talk we recorded here was with Dr. Manmohan Singh, just before he became Prime Minister.
Yeah. Well, he was a great colleague of mine, of course, here at that time, and I had really great colleagues, Sukumar Chakravarti, A.L. Nagar, Jagdish Bhagwati, Minal Datta Chaudhary, enormous number, Tapan Rai Chaudhary,
in fact, anytime people say that Manmohan Singh cannot talk, I send them a link to that interview because he can talk very well and very convincingly, and yet surprisingly for 10 years he did not talk.
I'm not going to discuss that with you. He was a good teacher.
Yeah, he was a good teacher.
Excellent teacher, yeah.
So that's the reason I said he's very convincing when he talks.
Yeah, he is, of course, because he was a great expositor too.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think the great thing was the combination of the chemistry of the really bright student and I thought I was very lucky to get a galaxy of professors as my colleagues.
Right.
And I think the interactions were so extraordinary.
But teaching of economics has changed, and as economics has changed over the decades.
It has changed in many different ways, but Delhi School of Economics was something of a pioneer at that time here, and it wasn't very different from, if you take specialized subjects like social choice theory, welfare economics, economic theory in general. I don't think there's a radical difference between what we were doing here and what I'm doing in Harvard or did in Trinity College, Cambridge, or in Oxford or LSE. I think the change is more about the content, the nature of the problem, how we approach them. I don't think the method of dealing with economic theoretical problems have really radically
But say,
changed.
till about a quarter of a century back, most economics in India was socialist economics, including Dr. Singh's.
I don't agree with that.
That's a good beginning for us.
It's a very good beginning. I think that's a confusion. It was an active state which did nothing for education, very little for healthcare. I don't know of any socialist state for which that's true. Even the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, Vietnam, they all had full literacy, healthcare for all. And if you judge socialism by that...
I was about to say North Korea, but I stopped.
But North Korea never had that, and I'm not sure it's a socialist economy. It's certainly a fascist economy of some sense.
Right.
But I think the confusion is that the role of the state in that case was quite high, and very often in areas in which the state really had very little to offer, like having a license rod, making business very difficult. And what the state could do well, namely education, public public healthcare, they did not. So call it a socialist state would be a complete confusion, I think. I'm not accusing you of that, but it's a common confusion. I think there was an active state doing things it was very bad at and not doing things which it would have been good at if they did it.
So, Professor Sen, you think just as the growth versus redistribution debate has got mired in a simplistic construct, so has this idea that economics used to be socialist earlier and now it's reform economics?
Yeah, I think both of them are fundamentally mistaken dichotomies. I think the socialist economics is probably the bigger one. To think of India as a socialist economy when more than half the kids didn't have any schools, didn't have any kind of health care, is ridiculous. Socialist economics, if you think of Soviet Union, initially China and Cuba, Vietnam, they had all kinds of economic incentive problems and they had to be dealt with. But they covered everyone in education and healthcare. And the engine of growth, particularly if you think of China today, has been to deal with an educated labor force and a healthy labor force. Which is why when it comes, Mr. Modi has quite rightly emphasized Make in India.
Right.
But Make in India means you can produce anything from thermometer to staplers to calculators to computers. Now we
to Rakis,
anything.
to icons.
But if you're educated labor force,
Right.
you can read what's being instructed, quality control and so on, and healthy labor force too. On the other hand, if you have some comfortable people who can do very well pharmaceutical, IT, auto parts,
Right.
and nothing of the flexibility, that represents a defect of the education and healthcare system.
Because then you can do complex manufacture.
But it has nothing to do with socialism.
Right.
It's something to do with, and socialism is an important idea, but this particular thing has nothing to do with it. It is the productivity of having a healthy, educated labor force, which is central to economic development, as Adam Smith argued more than 200 years ago. As he pointed out that we need economic growth, which, by the way, I've always supported, contrary to sometimes what I read in the papers.
I believe your PhD was on economic growth.
Indeed, the choice technique was all economic growth as a criteria which I argued for against others. And the main thing is to recognize that there are things that the state can do, education and healthcare, in a way that the private sector cannot. There are many things that the private sector can do which the state cannot do well. And unfortunately in India, it wasn't socialist, but it was very, very counterproductive arrangement where state tried to do things which it couldn't do well, like industry, license rod, and so
Running
on.
an airline, running hotels.
Running an airline and hotel, yeah. I still have to stay in a comfortable state-owned hotel. It hasn't happened yet.
Right.
And at the same time, didn't do the thing that the state ought to do, namely education and healthcare. That's not a failure of socialism. It's a failure
Of the state.
a bad kind of understanding of the duties of the state. And it doesn't help then to put education and healthcare as entitlement, which is really a ridiculous way of thinking about it. It's the basic responsibility of the state to meet the human rights of education and healthcare, which a citizen of a nation ought to have. That's the issue. And that is not versus growth, that is the biggest engine of economic growth. China would not have been where it is, but for that. Japan would not have been, Korea would not have been. We missed out that boat. That's the big thing.
So India is not a failure of any ism, it's a failure of governance.
Failure of governance, failure of clarity of thought. And when you did, for example, when the economic reforms happened, and Manmohan Singh had a big role in that, obviously a leadership role in that. And I did have a lot of conversation with him, I was in favor of the reform because I wanted...
In 1991?
That's in 91, I
Some
think.
of your critics say that you stayed away from reforms.
No,
in
I
1981.
said that I didn't. You can ask the Manmohan on that.
And then you're a Sen come lately.
No. My point then was that Manmohan could have done both together.
Right.
Namely, on one side, remove the controls and remove the license right, at the same time make a gigantic increase in healthcare and education. That was the debate. It was not about pro and anti-reform. The question was reform plus, not
Right.
reform minus.